Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone and welcome back to another exciting episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode we are moving forward with more in our A+ 22901 series, and joining us yet again in the studio, our good friend and mentor, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, I'm so glad to have you again, man. How's it going today?
Oh, man, it's going great. Really thrilled to be here. That's right. We are going to be looking at the bane of all IT existence today. Yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about printers and their drivers, things that like to drive us mad. No, just kidding, guys, but we do have to talk about printing. Remember, in your IT career, the whole entire network and everything can fail, but if one printer is still working, you can always print your resume out the front door. That's right. So we're going to be looking at a little bit of different technologies that do surround specifically SOHOs, MFDs, yes, acronyms right out the gate here, and printers. MFD, if you will, guys, sorry for the alphabet soup, but that is a multi-functioning device. So let's go ahead and step back real quick before we get into the specifics of this this episode here, and let's talk about these acronyms that we've kind of fed you right away. SOHO, what is that? Small office, home office, right? This is it's not even an SMB, right? Small to medium business, right? We can have a couple hundred employees, right? Could even be considered a small business. We say small office, home office. A lot of times what we're talking about is no more than 10 computers at best, right? So very isolated type of office environment, if you will. And isolated, I just mean very, very limited in the overall expense, limited in the amount of devices and people that you have inside of it. MFDs, well, what's an MFD? Well, that's a multifunctioning device. Well, why would what is a multifunctioning device? Let's go ahead and take a trip back to time, and let's talk about in the days when what would you do? You would buy a fax machine, you'd buy a printer, you'd buy a copier, right? What else would you do? You'd buy a scanner. Yeah, very good, the old flatbed scanners, right? And then what else would you have to do? You'd turn around and you would have to buy furniture for your equipment, right? You'd have to buy a desk. And even more so than you'd put the kids in a bunk bed and you'd move it into an office. So I want you to think about this. You just bought a whole bunch of inanimate objects, not only their own furniture, but you put them up for the night in their own room. So these devices, as time went on, a lot of the major manufacturers out there said, hey, you know what? Let's see if we can save some space and also save some money here, if you will, make it more economically feasible to have all these devices, and we'll just integrate them into one device. Now, I do want you to keep in mind when you have a multifunctioning device, what you have is one single device that is basically allocating its resources and functionality to different types of functionality, right? So that is going to be something that can be a limiting factor with MFDs. If you've got anytime you've got one device that's dedicated to a single functionality, its sole existence revolves around that functionality, a lot of times you get a really good performance out of it versus one that kind of divides the functionality between multiple different roles. However, they're cost effective, and again, they do save you some space. So that's a little bit about the SOHO, and that is a little bit about multifunctioning devices. And again, the objectives here: install SOHO multifunction device printers and configure appropriate settings are what we're going to be looking at. And one of the first things that they dive into is talking about configuring, using appropriate drivers. All right, when we talk about a driver, we've kind of talked about, as we've mentioned, hardware, and as we'll mention when we get into our operating system, kind of looking at what these little components are. It's really just a piece of software that allows us to control our hardware. Right, our operating system, it basically controls our hardware, but the only way it can control that hardware or even be aware of what that hardware actually is through that little translator that explains what it is and lets it talk to it, the drivers themselves. Print drivers, they can be a nightmare. All right, but if you're aware of the available drivers, the type of drivers, and you know where to look for them, they can also be very simplistic. All right, so I got a little list here of the print drivers that I want you to be aware of on the exam. All right, yes, you can see more acronyms, right? We have PPD, PCL, and UPD. All right.
Thanks for clearing that up.
That's right.
Appreciate
Okay.
it.
And moving on. No, just kidding. We got the first one here. We've got what is known as the post printer description. Very common printer driver. The second one here, we have one that's really been largely used in the HP world, the Hewlett-Packard world, and that's the printer control language, as well as the universal print driver. Right. We've been talking about MFDs just briefly. Right. Well, universal print driver is good because, well, think about it. Universal print driver. It works very, very well for MFD devices, if you will. I want to just back up real quick and mention in PCL, keep in mind there are different versions, right? PCL 5, PCL 6. Pay attention to the manufacturer's recommendations for these drivers. All right, you have to know that if I am going to install a printer within my network, I'm going to have to know what the manufacturer requires when it comes to the driver. Now, there are other types of drivers in here as well, too. You'll see raster bitmap and you'll see plotter vector. What do these mean? In fact, I should probably put a little forward slash there. There we go. What is raster bitmap? Well, raster bitmap is a driver essentially that doesn't really scale to very large type print jobs, and because raster bitmap kind of gets pixelated, the larger the print job, so there is a little bit of a limiting factor, but it is pretty much supported just by about almost every printer out there, so very common printer. However, plotter vector, right? When we say plotter vector, Dan, I know you were in the military before. You probably had to look at a map once or twice where you plot your vector on, right, a series of XYZ coordinates. And one of the great things about plotter vector drivers is because they use those XYZ coordinates, they're perfect for very large scale printing, right?
I actually worked in sign shops as a kid when I was in my teenage years, and we used plotters to actually cut out vinyl signs to put on things like boats and doors and things of that nature.
So scalability was just great,
Yeah,
right?
you just had it basically looked like a giant printer that you fed vinyl stickers into, giant files, and it would cut out whatever you want. And then you have it backed and masked, and you take it to a glass door, you put it on there and make sure it's straight, wipe it on, pull the masking off, and there's your sign.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, and you can see, well, I'm sure some of these signs could get fairly huge as well.
Yeah, the ones on
too.
the boats got very large
Yeah.
because you go off on these multi-million-dollar yachts and they're putting, you know, Queen's Prize or something.
Sure.
And they're as big as me.
Yeah, and when they're spending that money, they don't want it to look pixelated, right?
No,
We're not.
no.
Today, we look at things like Minecraft and we're like, that's awesome. But I bet you back in the days, if they got a couple $1 million yacht, they wouldn't think, oh, that's Galaga.
Yeah.
Right. So well, that's an Atari boat. But yeah, and that's some of the printers that you have to, or print drivers that you have to be aware of on the exam. You know the names, know the acronyms, if you will. Again, keep in mind things like your MFD devices work very well with the universal print drivers. Now, one of the great things about most of these print drivers today is that they actually have a small portion of memory, sometimes non-volatile memory, where the driver is actually stored on the firmware, within the firmware itself. We've actually got something kind of cool there. In one of the printers that we have, the manufacturer actually include a little USB device that you can just plug right in. So a lot of times your manufacturers will include the print drivers within the printer, so that we'll talk about shared printers here in a second, but when you connect to it, the print driver's ready. It's ready to go, it's ready to install, and it makes it really easy for you. However, one of the things I want you to keep in mind about any driver, especially drivers that come on an optical drive, come in a thumb drive, or come in the firmware itself, the printers can have a long shelf life before you ever buy them. However, the drivers themselves, they typically don't have a long shelf life, and manufacturers, as they update their products, they update do bug fixes, if you will, inside of their printer, inside of the logic, if you will. What happens is the drivers need to update. So always check the manufacturer's website to make sure that you have the most current driver when it comes to supporting your printers. Now, next thing they talk about is configuring settings. Some of the things that we can do. Let's talk about this a little bit, right? We have what is known as collate, all right? The very first thing we'll talk about is collate. Collate is a very interesting technique in the way that you can make sure that your pages, when they're printed and the output is in a predetermined arrangement. Right, so let's say, for instance, like we print our show notes here, and I give Dan a copy of the show notes so he knows, kind of where we're going within this episode. Well, if you think about it, if we've got 3 pages, right, for each collection of show notes, one for me, one for him, that's 6 pages, right? And if you're not collating your output, it'll print 1 page, and it'll print another page 1, then page 2. and then another page 2, and then a page 3, and another page 3. If you do collate, we can print 1, 2, 3, and again, the next set, 1, 2, 3. So again, collate's just a predetermined output. How do you want the printed output to be arranged? And that's predetermined by the collate settings. Other thing you have as well is orientation. All right, orientation is basically the layout of the print, right? The paper itself, how are we going to print the text or the image within the paper itself? You see that there are 2 orientations. We have typically what's portrait. All right, what you think about the 8x11 portrait photo that might be sitting on your desk, maybe your kids, maybe your wife, you know, maybe your dog or your cat, right? Maybe your favorite, musician. Versus landscape. Landscape, again, is more a panoramic layout, and these are settings that you can configure when you connect to the printer, and typically pre-printing, right? You can modify these. The other thing that we have, not only orientation, we have what's known as duplex. Guys, don't let duplex really concern you.
It's a place you live, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's not a triplex; it's a duplex, right? Duplexing just means the ability to print to both sides of the paper at one time. You usually have inside of your printers, and we got print technologies that we'll talk about a little bit more specifically that actually have basically the ability to. Sometimes they can do it at one time. It goes through a printer and it's printing on both sides. A lot of times what you have is an assembly that flips the paper around in a way that it prints on one side and then can turn around and print on the other. Duplexing just means that we can print to do two-sided printing, right, to both sides of the paper. The other thing is quality, and again, keep in mind, quality is just based on how clear do you want the output. I can actually give you an example here. If I was to, let's say, pull up one of these notes here, and I go to do this is specific to Mac, right? Windows, you can do this as well. Notice that it tells me presets, default settings, right? And if I choose down, it tells me some of the things that I can configure. I could say, hey, black and white, right? If there's text, I don't really care about the color, right? Dan and I just looking at text, I don't have any color on here. I don't have to waste the color. Color is expensive, and a lot of times you're talking about the difference between about 5-6 cents a paper versus 30 cents, right? It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you multiply that times 800, you're talking about it could cost your company a lot of money. But even more so than that, notice I want to show you the details here. Notice some of the things that we can do. Right, we talked about orientation, right? This is your portrait view versus your landscape view, and you can see how it kind of rotates, right? We could say, where is the feed from and what are the media types to? I can also do scaling. I can also set what kind of paper it's going to be printed to, and that's one of the great things that a lot of printers support multiple media. You could be doing envelopes, you could be letters, if you will, legal letters, cardstock, transparencies. Some still will print things like transparencies and labels, and you can always rearrange that too. So it kind of gives you an idea that you can print these different types. Now, I also want to mention, and Dan, I know I'm kind of jumping out in order. One of the things that comes up in the last part of the objectives is the ability to do what is. Oh, and you know what? I'm going to go ahead. I'll tell you what. I'm going to save that for a later episode. I was going to tell you briefly here, and we'll show you guys this again in one of our other printing episodes, is that you can also print a PDF. And PDF, that's the most common format. Microsoft's got one called XPS. It's not as common as PDF, but this is basically a virtual printing. You're not actually printing to a printer. You're taking the text on whatever it is that you're looking at, a Word document, if you will, and you're outputting it to a file, essentially. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. And we'll also double back on this iCloud, because this is this is an interesting type of printing technology. All right, so those are some of the settings that we want you to be aware of: duplex, collate, orientation, and quality. All right, now the next thing it comes down to is print sharing. They more specifically, they call out device sharing. And ladies and gentlemen, there are all different types of methods of device sharing. Let's go ahead. What we're going to do is we're going to run through these kind of one at a time and give you an explanation of what you might see. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, the last two, kind of outdated, kind of a
Yeah.
legacy technology. Serial is still mentioned. It's still mentioned on the exam. However, it's one of those ones that has pretty much gone by the wayside. All right, serial printing is that 9 dB connector that you would see in a 15-pin cable, or another 15-pin connector, if you will, that plugs into the printer port as well. Again, represented in your operating system is COM ports, as they call them, COM 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, communication ports. Parallel ports. These are our LPT ports, if you will. Line Printer Terminal, I believe, is what LPT stands for, and it would be LPT 1, 2, 3, and 4. Really gone by the wayside, right? Why has it gone by the wayside? Well, one of the big reasons is the fact that USB. USB became pretty much the wired standard for a long time when it comes to printing. And when we say wired printing, what we're talking about is a physical connection typically to the PC that you're printing off of, right? So when we look at these printing types, a lot of times what you would have is you would have a printer directly connected to the PC via an old parallel cable. The parallel cable, I think it was called the IEEE 1284 cable, and it used a 36-pin Centronics cable, almost looked like the old SCSI cables that you would plug into the back of the printer. And again, serial printers as well, also wired, cabled right to the PC. USB is primarily pretty much signaled the death blow for those older technologies. And Dan and I were talking, and in the many additions of our PC connections, we talked about the USB B-type connector that really kind of got its name, calling it a printer cable, if you will, just because, or a printer port, because of it was the most common.
You know, Wes, one of the ways that most people, they don't even realize that they've wired up their printer is through Ethernet, right? Their actual network connectivity. They have a cable running to the back of their computer. It's just not USB or something like that effect.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, I said one of the most common for a long time was USB. I got to be careful with that one today, because really one of the most common in today's environment is exactly what you said, that network cable, right? The Ethernet cable, Ethernet standard, RJ45 jack on the back of your printer. Now with these wired connections, minus the Ethernet cable, these earlier wireless connections, what you would have to do is you would have to use the software or the operating system to share out the printer, and people would basically be connecting to your PC, and your PC would be acting like a print server. We'll talk about an integrated print server here in a second. Now, however, keep in mind, Ethernet is essentially a networking technology, and this is what we would call a network-based printer. So glad you mentioned that one, Dan, because I certainly didn't have that one in the list, but we do have it on the objectives. We have to call it out. Now, on another note, sometimes you have physical limitations where wired or bounded cables just, they really aren't feasible, right? And there's many different situations. Maybe the location of the printer, it's not adequate to have some kind of wired connection.
Do not run a longer than 16-foot USB cable to a printer.
Yes, that's right. Hey, yeah, that's right. Definitely not. It might be the fact that wherever the room is, maybe you don't have an Ethernet port. Maybe you can't connect. You don't have wiring in that location, but you have to put the printer there. So how are we going to share a device out? And that's where some of your wireless standards come in. And there's many different, there's a few different wireless technologies that we need to be aware of. Now, when we talk about wireless, I've got basically, the big three up here that we need to really consider. Wi-Fi itself, that's an 802.11 standard. I will tell you guys that they call out the different 802.11 standards, 802.11a, B, G, N, and AC. Guys, if that's just a whole bunch of algebra there, we have a wireless section where we really go into every one of those individual standards. So we're not really going to talk about them here. However, when it comes to your printers and the devices that connect to them, be mindful of your wireless access point within the SOHO. It has to, the specifications have to match, right? So if you have an N-based access point, you have to have a wireless printer that supports either the B or the G or even A standard, if you will. So definitely watch the compatibility. Make sure that you have devices that can also connect to the wireless network over the same wireless technology. It is important. In other episodes, we talked about Bluetooth. Bluetooth being one of the PC connections that you can implement today. One of the great things about Bluetooth is that it's a less complex setup than Wi-Fi is. Wi-Fi does require you joining the device to the network. It requires the network-based devices to actually have a certain amount of configuration to be able to connect and print. Bluetooth is really nice because it goes through a pairing process. You turn the Bluetooth communication on the wireless printer. You turn your Bluetooth technology on whatever the device is that you're printing to, including things like mobile devices, which makes it even more convenient today because of the prevalence of mobile devices in and the necessity for mobility within your network, so it makes it really, really great. There's also near-field communication. That's kind of cool technology where if your printer and your devices support near-field communications, you can actually get within just a couple of centimeters of the device, or inches if you will, depending on what system you use, and you can actually touch the device to the printer itself to things like NFC tags, and you can transfer the data file right to the printer directly. So really cool technology. So when we talk about these, what are the benefits, if you will? That's a little bit about the technology, what technology we would use, why would we use wireless, right? Reduce cabling costs, right? Cabling is expensive. And better cable management, because the lack thereof, right? You don't
it's real easy to manage no cables.
That's right. That's right. You don't have all the rat's nest. I think about having a printer and all those other things that are connected to the back of your computer. So again, good cable management. We talked about overcoming some of the physical limitations that you might have, structural limitations too. Maybe you don't have. Maybe you're in a building that you can't just knock holes in the walls to run physical cables. Maybe you're working for or working in a building that's got some kind of historical value. And you say, sorry, this is a historical building, historical site. You can't just knock, walls down and start doing cabling. We've talked about printer positioning. That's something too. It gets a little bit more convenient when you have wireless network. All you need is an AC source. Typically, you need some kind of socket. One of the great things too is you can implement things like range extenders. Right? I can't get out the blue-handled cat cable stretcher, right? It's not really going to work. We can't stretch those well, we can, but they're not going to work too well after that. You can get wireless range extenders, right? So that's the benefit of, another one of those benefits. Again, when we talked about Bluetooth, Bluetooth reduces the complexity of the setup. I've already mentioned, pay attention to the compatibility when it comes to the 802.11 standard. One of the great things too, like, when we talk about, well, why would Wi-Fi be beneficial? Well, maybe your device doesn't support Bluetooth. I mean, that's not really, that's kind of uncommon when you talk about mobile devices, but maybe you have a laptop that doesn't support Bluetooth for whatever reason, The other ability too with Wi-Fi is the fact that you can get off of the industrial, scientific, and medical band that sits within the 2.4 gigahertz frequency and move over to the relatively unused, I think it's uniband, 5 gigahertz frequency, right? So again, you get better bandwidth, and
Bluetooth
better performance.
has shorter range as well, right?
Yes,
so you
sir.
get more range with Wi-Fi.
Yeah, that's a great point too, and not to mention on top of it, range extenders on top of that too. So if I have multiple buildings, right, we can use additional technologies to extend the range of the print, being able to print to the printer. So a lot of good things when it comes to implementing wireless. Now, there are some other technologies, Dan, that I kind of want to talk about here real briefly, and I know I'm kind of jumping around here in my notes, but let's go ahead and talk about the additional network technologies. There are things out there like, for instance, TCP they call out. They call out things like Bonjour, AirPrint, if you will. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Let's look at some of these other technologies. So TCP IP-based printing, again, is relative to what Dan was saying. We talk about things like our Ethernet ports, right? We plug in, and a lot of times to be able to find and locate these network-based printers that are wired or even wireless, you're going to use the TCP IP protocol stack. It's typically going to be an IP address. There are other ways that you can locate these printers too with URLs, if you will. The Uniform Resource Locator looks just like a web address. Bonjour itself. Bonjour is a really cool technology because we talked about things like, for instance, drivers, right, and services. Well, one of the good things about Bonjour is it really minimizes, if you will, the configuration, and this is something that we use inside of Mac-based products, if you will, that allows the communication between network-connected devices, applications, and services, and it allows us zero config-based technology. That zero config is zero configuration, if you will. So another great technology. And associated with that too is AirPrint, right? iOS devices, Mac OS devices, printing wirelessly via the LAN without the necessity for a driver. That's going to save you some time, right? That's what we use here in our Macs, AirPrint. In fact, you know what? Let's go ahead while I got this up here and let's do a print here. Let me find, let's open up HaruPad, right? All of these printers that you see here are actually being found by AirPrint, right? I believe we can see this down here, I believe. Maybe it's not in here, but these are your AirPrint-based printers, right? And if we want to find a printer, right, it'll go through the process of communicating across the network, and it will add these printers to the list. So great thing to have there with something like AirPrint. So a technology that they definitely call out. Let's see if I can cancel that and get back out of here. So definitely be aware of that for the exam. The other thing I want you to keep in mind that, when we talk about different printing protocols out there, you have what are known as integrated print servers. All right, integrated print server basically is a device that centralizes the management of printing, and we can have multiple devices that are printing to a network printer, right? And what happens is you end up having a queue, and a queue is the print job, essentially what you're going to print that's stored in memory. And if everybody's printing anytime they want, well, it can become a little bit convoluted when it comes to the whole, management of that printer itself. So if you have an integrated print server, what you can do is centrally manage all the print jobs, the print queue. Driver management is centralized, right? Centralized administration brings us more of a least administrative effort. Print permissions, right? Print, time of day printing. You're reducing the amount of pages that can be printed out. If you want to control things like black and white, because we don't want the company to get charged more money because people are just printed an 800-page color document that basically drains all of the ink, if you will, or whatever, if it's laser toner that you're using.
Listen, I downloaded a PDF book and I needed to print it out.
That's right. That's right.
So what's the problem?
That'll just be between you, me, and
right.
Facebook.
Yeah.
So again, it can. One of the things to keep in mind though is that a lot of your devices, if they do have integrated print server, it could be built right into the network-based printer itself. It's really about managing the print queue. That's one of the great things that you can do. Some of the protocols I've actually got in the list here, and some of the protocols that you can see that are used inside of this. So you got, for instance, MNP, excuse me, if I can say that right.
LMNOP?
That's right. That's right. That's Microsoft's network printing protocol. IPP, if you will, is the Internet Printing Protocol, and the last one is common in your Unix-based systems, Unix, Linux, if you will. That is the Line Printer Daemon, and it is a common protocol for printing across the network. Now, some of the last things that we want to talk about is cloud-based printing or remote printing. And there are technologies out there that allow us to do that. One of the ones that they specifically call out when they say cloud and remote printing is what's known as Google Cloud Print. I want you to think of this as a cloud service. This is software as a service, right? And basically being able to send information up to the cloud, if you will, and print to a printer. There are a lot of printers out there that support Google Cloud Print. It basically means that they're going to manage your print job for you. I think it's Hewlett-Packard, I believe, that is their equivalent to. It's called ePrint. So this is, again, cloud-based printing, a way to connect a printer from home or work to the cloud, if you will, the ability to print across multiple devices. I have a mobile phone. Maybe I'm not connected to the wireless network, but I really have to print this job. Well, I can send it up to the cloud, and they, according to if you have a cloud-based printing solution, your printer has that functionality built into it, you do have that ability. One of the great things about cloud-based printing is the fact that it eliminates the necessity for driver management. Why? Because you're sending it to the cloud and they manage the drivers in the background. So the responsibility to manage a physical printer by itself can essentially be allocated to a third party, some kind of professional cloud-based solution. It reduces things like device compatibility issues. And the other thing that you also get is access on demand. All right, Dan, we made it almost to the end of the episode. We do have one more thing when it comes to the considerations of printing, and that has to deal with data privacy. All right, you have to be very careful because if people can print to printers anytime they want, you might end up losing things like user authentication on the device itself. Again, this could cause problems, especially if you're in an environment where maybe you're handling credit card payment information. In the security world, they call that PCI DSS, private or payment card information data security standard. And if you don't have authentication, that might violate some kind of standard like that. The other thing I want you to think of that they call out on the exam, and this is something that's very important, is hard drive caching. Your network-based printers are really self-contained computers amongst being a printer as well. And if I'm caching that information, then there's the ability to pull that data out of the printer, right? You have a print job, you essentially send it to the printer. The print job stays in a volatile memory region called the queue, but to make sure that if the printer fails or the printer shuts down, it's written to the hard drive. Well, guess what? Anytime something's written to the hard drive, it means you can do data recovery on it later. This could be a security problem. So do keep that in mind when we talk about data privacy. If you are in a company that deals with credit cards, that deals with PII or personal identifiable information, thank you there, PHI, protected healthcare information that's turned around, and this could be a violation of your security policy. Again, the formal statement of what security means to your company. So definitely keep those in mind. But really like things like AirPrint because it makes driver management so simple. Google Cloud Print is another one of those ones that we can say, okay, you guys go ahead and handle the drivers in the background, and all I have to worry about is where do I find, what printer did I just send that to?
Well, if you feel like this was a bit of a torrent, a flood, as it were, of information when it comes to printers, well, guess what? We haven't even really scratched the surface. We've just gotten started. I know that down the road we're going to have plenty more to talk about when it comes to printers. But this was a really good primer. Understanding what print devices we have, multifunction devices, how they operate, and how we connect to them is definitely great stuff that we need to know about. Wes did a fantastic job of showing us that. We do appreciate it. We do appreciate you good folks watching, but looks like we're out of time for this episode. So thanks for that. Anyway, signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.